I think you are not audible currently. I think there might be a connection problem on the side of Mr. Pratika. I think he'll be joining soon.
Am I audible now?
Yes, you are, sir. Absolutely audible, sir.
Okay. You're Pranav, right?
Sir.
Yeah, hi. My apologies for
No
this
problem, sir.
technical issue. I think for some reason I was able to hear you all, but you all were not able to hear what I was saying.
Yeah.
So good afternoon, everyone, and I would like to extend my thanks to the RFMLR team for setting up this workshop. I think this is not the first time that I'm interacting on this platform. I've spoken before as well, and I think uh, interestingly, what started as one topic of discussion has now turned into a series which you are interestingly calling the Demystifying series. Earlier, I think in the last one we did something about due diligence and how due diligence is very important in the context of corporate transactions, M&As, etc. And now I think we are today covering a broader sort of theme. Due diligence was, I think, like a very small part of the entire, small but a very significant part of the M&A landscape and how M&A transactions unfold. But I think today we are going to generally delve slightly deeper into the corporate governance aspects of M&A and how the changing and evolving regulatory landscape in India is uh, leading us to a better place, hopefully, from a corporate governance standpoint. And what are the new themes in M&A generally, and what are the sectors that. The way I want to do this session, because it's not a lecture but a workshop. So what I want to do is I will at times digress from our topic, but that will always be to give you some practical insights into how things work. I mean, because I have been on the advisory side for more than 10, 11 years now. So I've seen a lot of M&A transactions happen in the market. I've seen, if not equally, but a significant portion of them not going through, not working out because of one or the other reasons. And I think when we picked up this topic, the idea was to try and do a deep dive into how transactions sometimes work and sometimes do not work because of corporate governance related issues. And so that's going to be the first part of our sort of discussion here. The next part of the discussion, I would want to give you some insight on some of the new sectors and themes in the Indian M&A landscape. And because you're all, I'm assuming the audience here, Pranav, is all everyone, I'm assuming, is a law student, right?
Probably, yes, sir. Mostly, yes.
Yeah. I think some of you might want to pursue litigation, some of you might want to do something else, but for anyone who wants to pursue corporate law or M&A team as a career option, it will give you some insight into what you need to be looking at from a sector perspective as well. Because when you become lawyers 2, 3, 4 years down the line, and then you slightly get more senior into the role, you will be definitely seeing some new sectors coming up in which M&A is now becoming more active than earlier because of the traditional sectors sort of dying out, quote unquote, and some of the new sectors coming up. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. But I think the idea again is to sort of make this session a little bit more practical and interactive for you. So why don't I actually start with, typically case studies and discussions are practical discussions are generally left to the end of a session, but I think here let's flip the order a little bit and actually start with a case study. And all the themes that we are going to cover today, I will try to somehow link them to the case study that we are going to look at, and it will give you a good insight on how corporate governance is very critical, a from an M&A perspective, and two, from a founder's perspective and from an investor's perspective, how are these things looked at from a different lens or a different perspective. So I'll share my screen now, and so my screen is visible. No?
Not yet, sir.
Allow to share screen. Okay. Visible now?
Yet, sir. I think it will be showing up in a minute.
Okay, what do I do here? It says portrait studio light reactions, share this screen. Visible now?
Yeah, it's visible.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So now then you'll be able to see this as well?
Yes.
Okay. So let's look at something, more practical here. So Europharm Solutions is a pharmaceutical company based in Germany. The primary goal of Europharm is to develop, manufacture and distribute a breakthrough drug for treating chronic migraine globally. Now, Healwell Pharmaceuticals India Private Limited, headquartered in New Delhi and incorporated in 2018, has achieved a significant breakthrough in developing revolutionary medication aimed at alleviating chronic migraine symptoms and improving the quality of life for sufferers. This makes Healwell Pharma a great target for Europharm, and Europharm Solutions is interested in diversifying its product portfolio as well and enter the lucrative Indian pharma and healthcare market as well. Now, before we go further, I'm just going to explain what we are talking about here. So we are looking at two different companies. One is called Europharm Solutions, which is a pharmaceutical company based in Berlin, Germany. And the primary goal of this company is to develop, manufacture, and distribute a breakthrough drug for treating chronic migraine globally. Now, this company has a broad product portfolio which includes various drugs. And each of these drugs is quite popular across the globe. And their drugs are consumed by people in, say, more than 50 or 60 countries globally. But what they've not managed to achieve till date is any form of breakthrough for treating chronic migraine. As all of us know, that there is no actual treatment for migraine available yet globally. Everyone is trying but failing. There are medications available which alleviate the symptoms, but there is nothing that cures migraine symptoms completely. Interestingly, Healwell Pharmaceuticals India Private Limited, which is an Indian company incorporated in 2018, has achieved a significant breakthrough in developing this revolutionary medication. So Europharm Germany is looking for something. Healwell Pharmaceuticals has that thing it is looking for. Now, this makes Healwell Pharma a great target for Europharm. Europharm is interested in diversifying its product portfolio and entering the lucrative Indian pharma market. So two things here, right? Europharm Solutions already has a sizable product portfolio and they have sizable presence globally. But what they're missing out on are two things. One is they're missing out on this migraine drug, and two, they are missing out on India as a pharma and healthcare market for them, which is a big gap in their business expansion strategy. Now, Healwell promoters got to know about the fact that Europharm is taking some interest, and they are also sort of looking for these two synergies here. And Healwell promoters, while they've revolutionized the market through this new drug, unfortunately they are kind of cash strapped and they don't have the necessary funding that is required to scale up their operations and reach as many customers as possible for the migraine drug, India and globally. So not globally, sorry, their migraine drug in India. Hence, they are amenable for an equity investment by Europharm. So this is kind of setting up the perfect stage where the target and the investor, their synergies are kind of meeting. The investor is a big pharma manufacturing player globally. They want to put in money. The Indian promoters have their own product, but they don't have the necessary funding to scale up the operations. Now, both the companies are motivated to expedite this transaction due to the presence of a competitor in India, which is actively developing a similar migraine treatment. Now, being the first to bring their product to market would provide a significant competitive advantage to the Healwell entity. And if Europharm invests, then Europharm also gets the benefit of the first mover advantage. As part of the deal that they are trying to broker, the money infused by Europharm will be used by Healwell to set up a new manufacturing plant in Maharashtra, India, to take advantage of government incentives and support for new businesses in the pharmaceutical sector. Clear till now? The understanding is Europharm is going to put in the money in Healwell in the form of an equity investment. Healwell will use that money to develop to set up a new manufacturing plant in Maharashtra, and they will also take advantage of whatever government incentives and supports are there for new businesses in pharma. Another interesting fact here, which will bring us to corporate governance, is Healwell had also tried to take certain equity investments in 2021 when its R&D team claimed to have developed an effective vaccine for COVID-19. So this is not the first time that Healwell has developed something revolutionary in the market. Earlier in 2021, their team had also developed an effective vaccine for COVID-19. While the product was tested and found to be effective, the investors of Healwell had backed out at that point of time after the initial due diligence, citing a poor corporate governance framework within the company and lack of transparency in operations. Yeah, so this is history. All that Europharm is trying to do now is present and future, but the historical perspective is very important here because Healwell had actually tried in the past but failed to receive equity investment because of poor corporate governance framework and lack of transparency in operations. Yeah, so I believe everyone here has understood the case study, at least what we are looking at: two entities, promoters of Healwell, history, etc. Now, I don't know this. This is the problem with having these online sessions. I don't know how interactive I can make this to be, but are people allowed to put in comments? Can they respond if I ask a question? How does this work? Are they all unmuted? Can they talk?
So they can put their questions in the comment box, and if they also want to talk to you, they can also raise their hands, and I can then unmute them.
Okay, perfect. So now, looking at this case study in the background, let me pose a few questions to you. In this case study, what is the M&A angle that you're looking at? Anything from an M&A perspective? What is the M&A that we are looking for in this fact pattern? Someone is waiting in the lobby.
Yeah. So I think it's from the Europharma thing that Europharma is might try to get Hillwell under its portfolio.
Yeah, correct. So the M&A angle, M&A has two words included in it. One is mergers, the other is acquisitions. So a merger happens when two or more entities merge and form a third entity, or two or more entities merge and either of the entities survive and the other entity loses its existence. That is a merger, straightforward. But in this case, for whatever reason, Healwell and Eurofarm are not actually looking for a merger. Then what are they looking for? They're looking for a situation where Eurofarm will put in an equity investment in Healwell. So what does that mean? This is the second word of M&A, which is the A, also known as acquisition. So Eurofarm is trying to acquire an equity interest in Healwell so that that company becomes a part of its existing portfolio of group entities. There are two ways to do this. One is to put money in the company, and the other is to buy shares of the existing shareholders. Now, if they bought shares from the existing shareholders of Healwell, then there is no inflow of money to the company. All the money that is received by the outgoing shareholder, the selling shareholder. In this case, that doesn't work from a synergy perspective because Healwell Pharma is looking to scale up operations. Their promoters are not looking to exit. So therefore, a share purchase transaction, in this case, an acquisition by a share purchase, is out of our window. That is not up for consideration. What is up for consideration is Eurofarm putting in new money in the company and the company utilizing that money. Now that is the first angle. Now we know what M&A is involved here. Second question, which we need to discuss now, is what is the corporate governance element involved in this whole framework? Like if we say that the earlier potential transaction of Healwell with an investor failed because of corporate governance issues, I want to understand if anyone has any sense on what are these corporate governance issues that could have created the problem as far as the previous M&A was concerned. Someone called Nishant has raised his hand. Nishant, would you like to take a shot? What is corporate governance and what is the interconnection between corporate governance and this M&A transaction not going through?
I have unmuted Nishant. Nishant, can you speak now?
Nishant has again raised his hand. I don't think he wants to speak. I think it's happening inadvertently. Prerak is saying lack of transparency will create future headaches for the holding company in relation to possible non-compliance or scrutiny by regulators. Okay, you've answered one part of the question. You've answered the question on why corporate governance issues will create problems for the investors. The first part of the question is, what are these corporate governance issues? When I say that an investment failed because of corporate governance issues, what could have the due diligence identified which prompted them to not go ahead with the transaction? Two more participants have raised their hands. We'll give this 30 seconds and then I will start talking. So if someone wants to speak, I think a hand has been raised.
Yes, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, Siddhant, go ahead.
So I'm not entirely sure, but an aspect of it could be the regulatory disclosures that are essential for every company that are imposed not only by the state, by the center, other regulators, SEBI, etc. If a company is not disclosing these things or complying
But
with these.
is SEBI relevant here? Did you read the name of the company? It said Healwell Pharmaceuticals Private Limited.
Also, in this case, because it's not a public company, I guess SEBI would not be relevant, but maybe other regulators. Like it could also be like the Competition Commission if there's a cartel being formed or something like that, like other regulators basically.
Yeah. I think one answer has come from Zen, says inaccurate financial statements. Okay, so I think all of you are right in bits and pieces and in parts. And Divyanshi is saying non-compliance to the rules and regulations for private companies and issues amongst founders. Okay, so you are in 1 second. Issues amongst founders. This is more about one founder fighting the other, right? Any recent examples of issues amongst founders creating issues for the company? One very famous celebrity founder, Mistry Tata. Okay, it involves ensuring transparency, accountability. On this. So the way M&A transactions unfold is before making the investment, the investor tries to do financial due diligence of the company. They do a legal due diligence of the company. And now increasingly, depending on the sector that is involved, there is EHS due diligence of the company. EHS is environment, health and safety. There is an ESG compliance. We'll talk more about ESG in some time. But there is ESG, which means environment and social governance standards. So those sort of due diligences are aimed to ensure that the investor has a clear picture of how the company is being operated from a governance standpoint and also from a regulatory standpoint. So now let's try and understand some very basic issues in corporate governance that a company might face. Obviously, this is a 2018 incorporated company. It's a promoter driven company. They don't have a lot of investors in them. They are classic examples of good engineers or people who know their product too well but don't know how to run the business. And I think this is very topical from a corporate governance and M&A standpoint now, because we are seeing mushrooming of these founders. And if you go to Bangalore, every 200 meters you will see a new startup. Every 100 meter there will be a founder who is waiting to start a startup. I was in Bangalore a couple of weeks back for some business development meetings, and I figured that in one lane that where I was sitting there, I was sitting in Third Wave Coffee. I figured that there were at least 10 startup founders sitting in that coffee shop, and another Third Wave Coffee which was at the end of the road. So one thing all of them have in common is the passion in what they're trying to do and the product they're trying to build. Another thing that they have in common is that they are all absolutely clueless about how to run a company and how to operate a company with proper legal compliances. So I'll tell you something as basic as the fact that a company which has a board of directors needs to meet at least X number of times in a particular year. Those meetings are not happening. Even if those meetings are happening, sometimes they are all happening over a phone, saying that, hey, 3-4 things on the agenda, why don't I send the agenda to you on WhatsApp, and then why don't you accept these 2-3 things and we will move on with life. There is no written record of meetings. There are no filings made with the registrar of companies. So any investor who is coming in and asking you questions like, you've been in the company for 4 years or 5 years now, can I look at all the decisions that your board has taken over the years? I want to understand the thought process of your board. When something important or fundamental comes up, how does the board react? But there is no record, because when you are asked to provide your details of board minutes, etc., you don't have any, or you have missing board minutes, you have missing shareholder minutes. Yeah. When it comes to the manner in which you are supposed to pass certain resolutions, like you're supposed to take a shareholder resolution for any new equity investment in the company, you're not doing that. You're supposed to ensure that appropriate foreign investment related filings are made when you take money from investors, and most of these startups are well funded from foreign investors, and obviously you can't expect a foreign investor to know the law completely unless they are institutional sort of investors like venture capital funds or private equity funds. If there's one NRI sitting somewhere in Singapore and he wants to put some money in your company, you know, there have been instances where money is coming into personal bank accounts in the form of remittance to a friend in India, and that money is then used in the company and the equity is given to that foreign investor. So there is complete sort of lack of understanding on how the regulations work in India, and unfortunately or fortunately, India has a whole host of regulations. So, from a corporate governance standpoint, the most important are the Companies Act framework. There are lots of rules and regulations and laws and processes that you're required to follow, even as a private limited company, starting from how many how many members you're supposed to have, to your constitutional documents, to running the company properly in the form of doing board meetings, shareholder meetings, to then appointing the necessary committees as and when you qualify, to having your financial statements. And I think someone just mentioned here saying inaccurate financial statements, and that is in fact a very sad reality. I mean, if you guys read the papers, are generally aware of things happening all around in the country, starting from startups to big entities. I mean, to not name anyone, but entities which have been under the scanner in various research reports. One common theme that is coming out is inaccuracy is not the word to be used, but what we are looking for is lack of transparency in the financial disclosures. Your financial statements are not disclosing transactions or liabilities in the same manner that are required to be shown to give a fair picture to the investor. In a country, there are lots of these entries in a financial statement that will give an investor or someone who is doing a financial DD in the company a complete picture, saying that this company has given certain guarantees, or the company has taken some money on credit, but that needs to be properly and fairly disclosed in accordance with Indian accounting standards. I think someone has just commented saying all the Shark Tank deals fall because of that. Okay, that I can't comment on that. A lot of investors there, a lot of clients, a lot of people who come there also come to us for advice. So I am not going to comment on that. But yeah, so the idea is that the corporate governance is a set of rules, regulations, and principles which ensure that the operations of a company are run in a manner which is compliant with the law. Not only the law, it is also compliant with the best possible codes and practices for companies that are codes and practices for companies depending on the sector in which they operate. Like, for example, if you are a tech company having 3 people, then most of the labor codes, typically like your provident fund, gratuity, employee state insurance, etc., ESI, those things are not relevant for you. They don't apply to you. So then if you go overboard and start giving provident fund contributions and registering yourself with provident fund agencies on the one hand, while you don't have any transparency in any loans that you've taken, obviously the investor will not care much about the former and they will be more careful about the latter. So you need to look at corporate governance standards depending on the kind of sector you operate, the number of people you engage, and how regulated your sector is. Now we come back to the case study. This is a pharmaceutical business that we are talking about. They've developed a new drug. Assumption is that they already have a plant. Let's assume they already have a plant in India selling their drug. They just don't have the funding to scale up their operations. So now what are the corporate governance principles that are important for them? What are the different areas in which their corporate governance will be tested here? So the most important area is going to be corporate compliances, like having all the basic board shareholders. You should have at least 2 directors on the board. They must have 2 shareholders on the board. They must have a proper authorized capital. Their accounts must be audited. They must have the necessary, well, someone said MGT 14. MGT 14 is just the ROC filing for resolution. So yeah, broad theme being that all the ROC filings, etc., must be in place. Now, again, very interestingly, because it's a pharma company, they need to have IPR. They need to ensure that whatever drug they've developed, they should have patents for those drugs, and their formulations or their drugs should not be infringing anyone else's IPR. Again, very critical. And how do you ensure that? You ensure that your processes around creation of the drug and the process, etc., properly documented, and you filed for the necessary process of product patent or whatever it is. And then another important aspect is, again, because you're a pharmaceutical company doing drugs, there's another whole host of regulations in India which is specifically applicable to pharma companies, and they need to have certain licenses and permits in place in order to perform these kind of functions, right? It's not a case where today I mix a bunch of chemicals and come up with a drug and say that this is a miracle drug, it works. You would have heard more in the case of COVID-19 vaccines, etc., that any new drug or any new vaccine globally, it's a global standard and also followed in India, needs to go through something called clinical trials. They need to be tested first, on animals, lab rats, etc., and then there are human trials. Obviously, in COVID-19, that human trials and all, I mean, there was some shortcut there to ensure that the drugs are available easier in the market and in a quicker manner. But typically, there is at least if not more, at least a 4 to 5 years life cycle from the time a drug is actually developed to the time that it reaches the market. And I think 3, 4, 5 years is like a bare minimum kind of timeline. Sometimes drugs don't pass certain tests, so they need to go back. So again, corporate governance angle yahan pe kya hoga? It will be that you have engaged sufficiently with the government, you have enrolled for the relevant clinical trials, you've passed the necessary trials, and then you are making the drug available in the market. Now, how can things go wrong on each of these fronts? We've discussed board and shareholder fronts. On the IPR front, well, I've developed a drug, but I can't explain how I've done it. I don't know what chemicals I mixed. It's just a drug that I have. So when the investor is doing its own commercial due diligence or a technical due diligence, they will want to understand how you have done the particular process that has led you to make this drug. Yeah, because your investor here, the potential investor, is also a big pharma company. They are also very careful about their own reputation on how certain drugs are developed. What all components does your drug include? Does it include components which are, say, for example, carcinogenic in nature, or which have side effects, which make sort of cause more harm than benefit to people? So that is the technical aspect of where things could go wrong, because in a lot of these situations you may not. So that's a thin line, right? Everything in corporate governance is not technically a legal requirement, but it's a very thin line because it always borders on a legal requirement. Like, there is no law which says that I need to prepare descriptive minutes to all shareholder meetings. I can just say one sentence and get on with life. But if you are discussing something as important as developing a new drug, you need to give proper disclosures to your board on what's happening and which team has done this and how they've formed. So that's something that is expected from you from a good corporate governance perspective. Similarly, you may not be required to ensure that any drug that you develop has zero side effects. But again, it should not be a case where something that you give to the consumers in the market, a few years down the line, it starts to have some massive chain reaction of side effects. So again, there are ethical standards which you don't meet in the coming 2-3 years, then it will lead to some legal implications. IPR, you need to be very careful that there is no one else in the market who has already made this drug and has also enrolled for a patent around it, and then when you name your drug, say Healwell, for example, or Migraine Well or something, you need to ensure that that name that you've chosen has not already been chosen by someone else. You are not taken in the market to be someone who is passing off someone else's drug as your own. Again, all of these things become very important for a foreign investor who has no idea about this market, who has no idea about what other players in the market are developing similar products or have enrolled for these products. So it's critical for you to give a transparent and accurate picture of exactly what is happening in your company. That is the interconnection between corporate governance and M&A. From a legal standpoint, from a technical standpoint, from a commercial standpoint. Now coming to environment, health and safety. A lot of the times now foreign investors, particularly from European jurisdictions, are very particular about environment, health and safety. Like the plant that you already have, you are going to take their money and set up a new plant. But it's going to be you who is going to do it. They will just pump in the money. So what will they want to see? They will want to see how your existing plant is being run. Like if they go for a plant inspection, and I've done a number of deals in the past where entities based out of Germany came to India, tried to acquire small manufacturing units based in Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, and sometimes it was Far East in the northeastern states as well, where something miraculous is happening in that manufacturing plant because they're developing some niche product which practically no one else is doing in the world, not only in India. It's something to do with that they are going to utilize my money well and in a manner that is not going to create more troubles for me in the future. And when I first asked the question on corporate governance, I think someone had responded saying that the reason that could have failed from a corporate governance perspective is because the investor may not want more headache in the future. Now your answer is correct, because on the day of the transaction, this might go through, because not every violation, not every small non-compliance with law is a deal breaker from an investor's perspective. But your corporate governance and your regulatory standards are very important. It they're like a litmus test for your standard of governance. Like how are you going to run the company? So as M&A lawyers, we are oftentimes asked by our investor clients to ensure that from a legal diligence standpoint, we try to review all the corporate documents of the company. We try to review all business related contracts of the company. We review all the company's land holding related papers, if there are any lease agreements, if there's any IPR being used on a license basis, what all health insurance policies, what all insurance policies are there in the company, what is the situation of the IPR, etc. So all of this present a holistic picture of how the company is actually run. Now, in the instant case, and I think because this is a pharma situation, I think we've already delved into what type of things the investor will look for. So from this case study, now let me jump to how Indian laws and the regulatory framework are trying to evolve with the changing dynamics of the corporate world to ensure better corporate governance frameworks, to ensure companies run their operations in a more transparent manner, and the interests of all the relevant stakeholders is protected. So there are these three important aspects in my mind here. One is being compliant with the law. Second, adopting the highest ethical standards from an industry perspective. because what you do today is going to be an example for someone else in the future tomorrow in terms of how you run the company in that sector. And three, protection of interests of all the stakeholders. Now, who are your biggest stakeholders? Obviously, your shareholders. And who is the custodian of ensuring that all the interests of the stakeholders is protected? In a company, who is that custodian? Anyone? It's a one-word answer. Correct, all of you. Board of directors, correct. Board of directors is the custodian of compliance. They have fiduciary duties under the Companies Act. So they have legal duties, which is to take decisions, etc. And they have fiduciary duties. And the most important fiduciary duties is to take decisions which are in the best interest of all stakeholders concerned, basically being shareholders in this case. So let's divide this discussion now into some themes, and the way I would want to present this is like not in a very structured manner, but let's just take a few examples of recent regulatory developments that will give you some insight on how corporate governance is now becoming very important and critical. Now, we will come to SEBI related aspects later because that's a very small part of the market. A big section of the Indian market of any form of companies developing products, etc., is still private. So let's look at certain thresholds and certain standards that are relevant for all type of companies. And these are themes that are coming out from recent regulatory developments. First, does anyone know anything about the Digital Data Protection Act, which Digital Personal Data Protection Act, which was passed recently by the Indian Parliament, called the DPDP Act? The term DPDP Act is a hint for you. And now, again, because it's a workshop, I want people to also speak up, to write. When I tell you that the DPDP Act or protection of personal data is a very important aspect from a corporate governance standpoint, what do you understand from this? Do you see any interconnection between corporate governance and something like data protection, digital data protection? Let me give you 30 seconds and you can compose your answer. I think I just need some wild thoughts. The Act focuses a lot more on data fiduciaries. Okay, first question. What type of, because we've been doing a lot of pharma, manufacturing, environment, etc. Now let's jump to tech. Obviously, DPDP Act kind of focuses on digital personal data, right? So now what are the kinds of companies where something like a digital personal data will be very important from a corporate governance standpoint? The data of investors / company is very important, and while a company is doing investment, it is important to keep information private and confidential. Okay. For firms which are processing data of customers need to be compliant with the Act. Act focuses a lot on data fiduciaries. Any more? Platforms and D2C businesses which process data will need to comply. Fintech, communication platforms that facilitate. Okay, lots of answers coming in. Okay, I'll explain this now. I think a lot of your answers are correct. Ad tech, ed tech, agri tech, anything which has the word tech involved at the end, and any business that collects a lot of data. You're the Zomatos of the world, the Swiggies of the world. You name these, right? The Shadi.coms. I'm just giving different examples from different segments. These are all tech companies, but let's look at the whole spectrum. Something like a Byju's, it's an ed company, right? But does it deal with data? Yes, of course, it has data of crores of Indian students. Similarly, an agri-tech company, can we look at some verticals of, say, ITC or some other entity which has something to do with agricultural technology? Do they have data? Do they deal with data? Yes, of course. They have data of a lot of these farmers. They have data about a lot of farmlands, and all the seasonal crops. What technology is being engaged. They in fact have drone monitoring systems, etc., on whether a particular what part of it, what part of the farmland is divided into what type of crops, etc. So again, huge amount of data. Ad tech, advertisement technology. Your portals of the world, like the Just Dials of the world, again dealing with a lot of data. And then you move to a more traditional spectrum like food delivery platforms, Zomato, Swiggy, Shadi.com portal, obviously having a lot of personal data of people. So the theme here is that, especially for companies which deal with a lot of data of their customers, I am seeing a lot of answers coming in about data fiduciary, data processors. So the reason data processors is kind of a different case study, or data fiduciary is a different, data processor is a different case study, because these entities are actually set up to process data. I'm talking about entities whose primary business is not data, but whatever they do involves a lot of data collection. One could argue that the primary business of all these companies is collection of data, because the reason the WhatsApps of the world have billion-dollar valuations is not because it's a chat platform, but because it hosts a lot of data. Like same with Facebook, Meta, etc. But I'm not going into that territory of discussion here. What I'm trying to explain is, let us ignore for a minute those companies which are processing data and those companies which are, say, consent managers. If you have any sense about the new DPDP Act, now the law requires you to take consent. So there are now entities which are tasked with, or the entities which specialize in taking consent of customers for sharing of their data, etc., or processing of their data. I am talking about regular companies doing regular businesses like agriculture, education, food delivery, matchmaking, etc., etc. Now, historically, all of these companies collected a lot of data, processed them with that one standard tick box saying, I agree, continue. And all of the data was potentially sold to big multinational corporations who came and gobbled up these entities. Like, classic examples, right? I mean, the Flipkarts of the world have been acquired by Walmart. Like, what was so lucrative about the Indian Flipkart business that Walmart was ready to pay billions of dollars for it? Obviously, it's the business setup in the form of the tech, but Walmart can probably, having deeper pockets, can set up a much better tech, right? It is the customer data that Flipkart has. It is the number of customers that they have. It is the connect that they've already built with the Indian market. Leveraging on that connect, they can build a new business, and they can figure out what are the trends, what is the Indian market thinking, what are people's choices, preferences, and all of this was practically getting unregulated until now. There was the Information Technology Act did talk about destruction of computer data. It did talk about unauthorized use of electronic data, but it was always superficial. It kind of bordered on there was something called the SPDI rules, called Sensitive Personal Data and Information Protection Rules, but that was again very limited in scope. It had things like your mobile number, sexual orientation, medical records, etc. So if you leave those 5-6 things aside, then nothing else was getting covered in the ambit of SPDI rules. So now, coming back to our theme, corporate governance dictates that you work in the best interests of your stakeholders and your customers. Now, the best interests of your customers is protected when you are using their data and their information in an ethical manner. Companies were not doing that, and they were actually utilizing, or they were actually taking advantage of some loopholes in the law to sort of divulge customer data. Now, what does the law do? What does the regulator do? The regulator steps in and creates a set of legal principles and regulatory framework that plugs the gap, that ensures that if you are not voluntarily opting for good corporate governance, because a lot, as I told you, a lot of good corporate governance is not actually law, but it borders on that sort of territory where it will create a legal problem for you, or in order to fix that unethical standard of business, a new law needs to be brought in. Yeah. So the DPDP Act was presented. Of course, it has a wide-reaching impact on how data of customers is collected, how it is processed. Now, if you're familiar, it's very clear in the act now that the data has to be used exactly or only for the purpose for which it was collected and for no other purpose. As a data processor, you need to take that into consideration. Even if you are taking consent of the customer to use his personal data, you need to take proper consent and in a manner which is as easy as collection of the data is. So there are these standards that the law has now set out, saying that the customer needs to consent in a manner that is easy for him to understand, easy for her to understand and figure out what consent they are giving. And two, most importantly, revocation of consent is also now brought in. That if today I want my data to be shared to an insurance company for marketing me a new insurance product, classic example, I bought a car today. You know, the car dealer has all my data and information about my mobile number, you know, what car I've purchased, etc. The car dealer goes and sells the data to an insurance company. An insurance company start calling me for taking on a new insurance policy after the end of say 9-10 months. You know, the policies are for 1 year period, so they'll start calling me from the 10th month onward, or they will start calling me for an extended warranty. So now, earlier what was taken as, "Arey, this is a telemarketing call, why don't I shut this is all, I'm not interested in this." But none of this was illegal. Telemarketing was not illegal. But from a dealer's perspective, good corporate governance dictated that you do not divulge your customer information for money, and you ensure that you are behaving in an ethical manner with your customer. He came to you to buy a car, you gave him the car, and that transaction should end there. You should record the data for your purposes and to ensure continuity of information for, say, a mandatory period of 5, 6, 7 years, but you should not pass on the data. So the regulators are now putting an iron hand on these unethical practices as far as data protection standards were concerned. There are certain localization requirements for people who were selling data outside India. So that again becomes a huge burden on companies which were sharing data on servers located outside India, correct? And obviously penalties. How is the law catching up? The law is saying that, okay, if you don't want to voluntarily comply, we will force you to comply and we will impose heavy penalties. Now, do you know that fines under the DPDP Act run to a maximum of say 250 crores? I mean, it seems to be a very unbelievable number, but it is unfortunate. It is the truth. The maximum penalty under the DPDP Act is 250 crores. So this is again law catching up with corporate governance, catching up with to ensure better corporate governance. This is an evolving regulatory landscape. Europe realized this many years before us. There's this thing called GDPR, Global Data Protection Regime, which is applicable across European Union countries. India's DPDP Act is also kind of modeled on the GDPR, and a lot of principles like customer consent, revocation of consent are taken from GDPR. So in the reason GDPR was also implemented was what? Poor corporate governance across the European Union regime for collection of data and processing of data. Similarly, in India, now the law is catching up to ensure you are governed in a better manner. Now, let's look at something else. Now, let's look at IBC. Do you know what IBC means? Any idea? IBC is the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code 2016. So again, very good example of the law forcing corporate governance. While IBC by the name itself you would think that the entire purpose of the act is to destroy companies and promoters and not to ensure better corporate governance. But something called a deterrent effect. Sometimes deterrents work. So earlier, what used to be the case? Companies were blatantly non-compliant with a lot of governance standards. Lenders would want more information about how their money is being used. What are the financial performances of the company over the past years? Whether the company is still in a good financial shape to repay the loans. If the lender has imposed certain conditions on having a particular standard of auditors in the company, companies were blatantly disregarding that and then just getting away simply because in India it used to be and it still is equally painful to call a default under a loan and then try to enforce security and sell it in the market. Because it's such a tough and complicated process that sometimes, again, ILNFS, very good example, sometimes lenders actually used to get scared of initiating any sort of recovery proceedings because court proceedings used to take so much time in India that you file a suit for recovery, you call a default, the promoters will drag this on for years and decades. Now, what was happening? As a result, a lot of loans were going bad. There was less and less and less incentive for the promoters to ensure that they run the operations of the company in a manner so as not to jeopardize the creditors and their security. Companies were not listening. Companies were going delinquent in these obligations. So in 2016, law catching up, insolvency and bankruptcy code. Now, what happens is you do any default now, and the lender sends you a demand notice as soon as you've not appointed the auditor that the lender wants you to appoint. There's a demand notice on you because it's an event of default. If you don't immediately pay under that demand notice, you are slapped with this thing called the Corporate Insolvency Resolution Process, CIRP. So any secured financial creditor can go to the National Company Law Tribunal now and say that this company needs to be dragged to CIRP because it has defaulted on its payments. Now, that payment default may not have arisen because of the company's inability to pay, but the payment default could have happened because of poor corporate governance standards. The lender may not be happy with how the company is run, so they would have called a default saying that I want my money back. So a loan that was amortized for say 10 years, if the lender immediately wants all the money back, then you're going to default on the repayment, right? And you get dragged to IBC. So now this fear of IBC, while good example, Kingfisher Airlines insolvency was a wake-up call to further reform current laws. Very topical. Very good example. What happened? What went wrong with Kingfisher? They took all the monies from the lenders, banks, and financial institutions. You name a bank, and Kingfisher had a loan from that sort of bank, and the promoters had loans from banks, and they kept pumping more and more and more money into the airlines. They splurged on a lot of things where the lenders and investors were all asking the company to be equally cautious and adopt better corporate governance, adopt better fiscal prudence from a corporate operations perspective. None of that was illegal or something for which an action could have been brought against them. But eventually, all of that piled up and it led to a situation where Kingfisher defaulted on almost all of its obligations, financial obligations. Promoters were in a soup. And the lenders, unfortunately, had to keep waiting till the end to then realize something out of it. And even I think a few years back, you would have heard that those recovery proceedings are still ongoing. The lender's money has still not been repaid in full. I mean, sometimes you hear the mansions being auctioned, cars being auctioned, etc. But this is all post facto. This is all hindsight. In hindsight, the lenders could have taken a better decision or could have maybe dragged Kingfisher much earlier to some sort of an insolvency resolution situation, and this could have been avoided. Now your question would be, again, Jet Airways coming back is a sign of better times. Again, now the question is, how does IBC lead to better corporate governance? except instilling a fear in the minds of the promoters that if I do anything wrong, I might be dragged to corporate insolvency resolution. Keep that aside. How does the IBC mechanism ensure better corporate governance? Let's see if someone can answer this. And your hint is in the words corporate insolvency resolution process. COC will ensure better management of liquidity. No, you are taking this, you are actually going much deeper. I'm on a much more basic front here. My question is much more basic. CIRP focuses on business reorganization. Now you're on the right track. Shashwat is on the right track. Okay, so the answer for you is, what is the purpose of IBC? What is the purpose of dragging a company to CIRP? From a creditor's perspective, the immediate purpose, I mean, obviously a creditor wants repayment of all its loans, right? But even a creditor knows that if they drag a company to CIC, that doesn't mean that magically all the loans will get repaid and they will go out. Exactly. Now I think the answers are coming up. Vanshika, Sunidhi, Prerak again. The aim of IBC, and because we're talking about corporate governance, the aim of IBC is to completely change the management of the company. So the existing promoters lose their company, and that is how IBC becomes a deterrent. And IBC is also an instrument of change. IBC is an instrument of change. Why is this an instrument of change? Because in a CIRP situation, a resolution professional RP is appointed, and the aim of the RP is to ensure that the company is run on a going concern basis in the best possible manner, in the most professional manner possible. And then they invite applications from potential resolution applicants who come in and put a bid to take over the management of the company. So if the company has been run in a pathetic manner, and I think someone gave that example, Jet Airways is a very good example of this interconnection that we are talking about between corporate governance and M&A, or corporate governance and IBC. There were lots of dealings, etc., from the promoter and promoter family, Naresh Goyal and family, and other sort of promoters in the company, where it was felt by the lenders and the regulators alike that the affairs of the company are not being run in a professional, ethical, or legal manner. So it is one thing to prosecute one person, but you know that prosecuting any one person cannot solve the problem as far as a big company like Jet Airways is concerned. So what an IBC kind of a mechanism starts to do is that it aims to ensure that the management of the company is completely transformed and someone else enters the company and tries to run it in a better manner. So that's IBC for you. Again, in the interest, someone is saying, in the interest of creditors, and also RP's independence is to be noted. Exactly. Because an RP is a professional, he will ensure best corporate governance standards, because his remuneration, he gets a remuneration, but his reputation in the market is tied also to how well he has managed to run the company in the interim period while he is the IRP, and also to see who takes over the management and what is the process that is followed. So the committee of creditors then imposes better corporate governance on the company. They will only approve a resolution application if it meets the technical and financial parameters, if it meets the financial parameters, and if it also meets the technical parameters, because a committee of creditors will then potentially look at a better group from a corporate standpoint. If a particular group is very well renowned for following ethical practices, they might want to prefer that group over another group which is maybe offering a better financial package to the creditors. But the creditors believe that a couple of years down the line, this company is going to again be in a soup because these guys are not credible enough, right? So in Jet Airways, you've kind of seen the same thing happening, where IBC was triggered, existing management was out, Jalan Kal Rock, you would have heard those terms before. They were successful resolution applicants. There's still a lot of restructuring, etc. happening. But the ultimate objective of this is better corporate governance and also M&A. Yeah, because eventually what is happening? You are acquiring a sick enterprise. You are acquiring a company which has gone into IBC. So the corporate governance standards which were not fulfilled while the company was still afloat have been forced to be adopted, and then you are entering the company, or have been forced to be adopted by your entry into the company. So again, IBC is a landmark legislation which has been passed in the past decade or so to ensure better regulatory overview and insight on how companies are run, and to create a deterrent effect to ensure companies follow better corporate governance standards. Third theme that I would like to talk about is something known as ESG. I think some time back I mentioned ESG. Can someone tell me what ESG is? Anyone? ESG is the flavor of the market. I think some of you potentially in the next 10 years are going to become ESG specialized lawyers. You're going to only do ESG related work. Okay, I can see some answers here. Environment, social governance. Yeah, but what are these terms? What does it mean? And when you talk about, you do any workshop, you read any literature on corporate governance, ESG will stand out. Why? Because it covers the whole paradigm. It covers environment, social, and governance. So can someone tell me through a comment, or maybe you're very open, I would love to hear from someone. Typically, what are the components of ESG, and what does it mean in the context of corporate governance and M&As?
Hello, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, Siddhant. Again, only
Yes,
Siddhant
sir.
wants to talk.
So as
So
far
we
as
have anyone else interested? Next time we'll take it from someone else who's interested. Yeah, Siddhant, go on.
All right, sir. So as far as I know, the ESG concept starts from something called as the CSR reports, which was mandated, I think, in the European Union before. Only recently, because of the BRSR guidelines, the top 1,000 listed companies, they have a format for ESG disclosures for these companies, and a lot of companies also voluntarily do it. Also, there have been a lot of research, again, as you mentioned, that a lot of companies would prefer investing in a company that has better ESG disclosures over financial performance of the company as well. This broadly includes, like, even if all of these records obviously are accessible to the public, so if one goes through them, they include the share capital of the company, they include the number of sexual harassment complaints, for instance, under the social part of it. It includes, for example, if it's a tannery, then the amount of heat that is produced by it, etc. So it tries to give a basic overview, basically try to quantify all of these measures.
Superb. That's a great answer. I think it just sums up everything in I think 3-4 sentences. So you're right. I think you mentioned something called the BRSR standards. So the BRSR standards are actually business responsibility and sustainability reporting standards. And just to give you some context, the business responsibility and sustainability reporting standard was the BRSR standard was introduced by SEBI in I think 2021, very recently. That's not applicable for all private companies, etc. It's mostly applicable, as again Siddharth mentioned, I think the top 1,000 BSE NSE listed companies. I'm sorry, may I take a 30-second break? There's just one very important call I need to take. Yeah.
Sure, sir.
Okay, sorry, I'm back. Yeah, so what I was saying is, obviously, as he mentioned correctly, this is only applicable for BSE top 1,000 listed companies, but a lot of companies, very important to note that BRSR being mandatory to you, or BRSR disclosures being mandatory to you versus you having to do this as an industry standard are two very different things. and BRSR standards have actually laid the groundwork for more and more companies coming into voluntary compliance mode. Now a lot of lenders in the world, and we deal with a lot of equity investors, we deal with a lot of debt investors. I can tell you for sure that ESG compliance or ESG standards, as they call, are now a very important parameter while a potential investor is evaluating a company from an investment standpoint or from a credit standpoint, from a lending standpoint. Now, why is this important? Because BRSR disclosures or ESG disclosures contain three basic elements, right? Environment, social, and governance. Now, taking governance first. Governance is basically everything that we spoke about. Management disclosures, board report, your financial statements, your compliances with applicable laws, etc., etc. That's governance for you. And something called a management report that BRSR also dictates will have various kinds of disclosures by the management of the company and directors of the company around what principles they are adopting to ensure they are more compliant with the law and what is their present compliance situation. Then there is social. Again, as Siddhant mentioned, I will take his example. Social is basically nothing but talking about your people. It's very important. You say a business is only as good as the people that it involves, right? Of the people that it employs. Your employees, your human resources are now increasingly becoming more and more critical from the lens of you being judged as a better governed company. How you treat your employees, what is your EPF compliance status, what are your gratuity policies, are you completely abiding by your maternity benefits policies? Again, S and G are interlinked because governance typically covers all of this, but S kind of focuses on a lot of HR related compliance and governance matters. They would want to see whether you've been giving maternity benefits as per the legal requirement. They will see how many sexual harassment at workplaces, how many POSH complaints have been received in the past 1 year, whether you have a proper POSH committee with wider representation, how many complaints have been received, how many complaints have been handled, what is the investigation that you've done for those complaints, what is your leave policy, how do you handle burnout of your HR, of your employees, etc. Do you have offsites? Do you take them for trips, etc. All of these things, these are not maybe questions that are asked of you, but these are all disclosures that companies make to ensure that they stand good on the S part of it. What is the leadership's perception? What is the salary structure like? Is it so top heavy that all the money is being kind of given to the CEO, CFO, CXO level people, and then the people at the bottom are just working their hours off for not such a good return? All of this becomes very critical because investors are scrutinizing you from the perspective of how well you manage your people. And last but definitely not the least is E. Again, a lot of comments here are saying carbon footprint, and Siddhant said something about the tanning business. I think we discussed E briefly, that it depends on the kind of industry you are in. The question is, if you are a drug manufacturing plant, or if you are a steel production plant, or if you are, say, again, in the tanning business or chemicals business, then it's more and more important to ascertain what are your best practices as far as the e-compliance is concerned. Now, again, as I told you, S and G overlap. There is a lot of overlap between E and S, and there is a lot of overlap between E, S, and G. And I will give you some examples of laws here. A law like the Factories Act. Have you heard of Factories Act? Anyone? I think you would have, if you are all fourth year students. I remember studying in RGNUL industrial laws. It used to be that one exam where we got 1 day to prepare, and obviously we used to only study 1 day before the exam, and then we realized that we have the exam paper will cover 17 different legislations, and there used to be this really fat book of industrial laws, and God only knows how we managed to mug it up and then, literally put something to writing in that papers, because everything we knew about any law, no matter what the question was, we were dumping that answer in the paper. So yeah, coming back, we've all read Factories Act, right? Factories Act is a perfect example. It applies to factories and industrial establishments. So it's only going to be critical for you if you're running a factory or industrial establishment doing any manufacturing activity. I mean, not going into all those nuances, but assuming you qualify for one, right? Now, if you look at the provisions, and again, we looked at all of these provisions for the first time one day before that exam, but these things have stayed on with a lot of lawyers like us, is that there are things about, Factories Act requires you to have a creche. It requires you to have proper toilets. It is that legislation which tells you what should be the minimum shift or the maximum shift time. You need to give a holiday, etc., etc. All of these things are nothing but ensuring your people are kept in a better environment, a better work environment. So that is S. But something like having a toilet or something like ensuring proper shifts is also overlapping with E. How does it overlap with, in fact, a Factories Act and another legislation? Have you heard of of this legislation called Industrial Disputes Act? There's Industrial Disputes Act, there is Factories Act, and again, I can't remember the whole 17 acts, obviously. There's the Environment Protection Act. There are regulatory bodies like the State Pollution Control Board. So if you are, say, going for an environmental clearance, which is environmental impact assessment. Your environmental impact assessment is carried out, you're given an environmental clearance, and then you are given a license to work a factory if you want to operate a factory. And then these Factories Act related compliances have to go hand in hand for the entire length of your business operations until you are maintaining that factory. So how do you reach this stage? Sometimes what happens is you will not be given a license to work a factory until all of the compliances that are required are either fulfilled under the Factories Act, until you have met all the S related conditions, because some of these boxes need to be ticked. When the labor inspector comes and inspects your facility, you will only get a Factories Act license if you are able to fulfill those conditions that are required for compliance with Factories Act. You're going to fulfill those conditions that are required to ensure that your labor is safe and is not exposed to hazardous chemicals, right? You are required to ensure that the surroundings are not exposed to hazardous chemicals. You dispose of your waste in the correct manner, correct e-waste management, or not e-waste, regular waste management. How much carbon are you producing? Are you reducing the carbon footprint of the world, or are you increasing the carbon footprint of the world? So again, I will go back to the example of this M&A deal that I was looking at some years back, where the Germans went to the plant. When they went to the plant, they literally saw 200 liters of diesel lying around because they were used in some of the machines. Obviously, diesel is highly inflammable, right? And there was some burning happening 50 meters within a 50-meter distance from where this petroleum thing was kept and stored. And then they immediately called me and asked me, saying, is there any law in India which mandates or which restricts the amount of petroleum that you can store, or the manner in which you can store petroleum products in a facility? So we did some reading and we figured that there is actually a law on this. Now, this hazardous waste disposal related laws are there in India. There is the Air Act, Water Act, there is a Boilers Act. All of these are meant to ensure that you follow the best possible E standards, the best possible S standards as well, because you need to ensure that your people are treated better, and obviously the best possible G standards, because all of these compliances require regular reporting. It's not like you've got an environment clearance once, then you forget about it and do whatever the hell you want to do. There are regular inspections, regular checks, there are annual performance reports, annual environment reports, etc. Time to time, you must do an environmental assessment. You must refresh your technology, etc., to ensure you're keeping up with the times. These are all G. From an ongoing perspective, this G is again becoming very critical. So From an ESG perspective, again, what is the overlap between ESG and M&A? We are seeing that more and more M&A deals have ESG as a core focus area. Sometimes ESG is also a deal breaker. If there are environment, health, and safety concerns, the investors may not want to invest in the company. And how is the law evolving? The law, I mean, again, because you've read these things, I don't know whether you're familiar with the new labor codes that India had tried to adopt. The parliament had tried to adopt. Any idea about the new labor codes? Again, linking corporate governance, M&As, and evolving regulatory landscape. India had passed new labor codes. There were 4 big labor codes that came out. One was someone says, yes, sir. Yeah,
Social
even
Security
spittoons.
code, sir.
Actually, it's actually that word spittoon reminds me that this is one word that. So one word was latrines, the other was spittoons. We distinctly remember that one day before the exam, we were flabbergasted to know that these words are finding place in a prominent legislation. That it's a requirement to keep these things in the factory. So coming back to the labor codes, we created the code of wages, we created the code on social security, we created an industrial sort of it's a big name. I think it's an industrial something.
Code.
Yeah, industrial relations code. I think all of these codes actually compress 5, 6, 7 legislations into one, and then create a better sort of compliance framework. So if you look at how these labor codes were developed, again, this is another classic case of the law catching up with corporate governance, where there are now strict parameters, there are detailed rules under each of these codes to determine how much amount needs to be paid to an employee, for example, when they're leaving. How is the gratuity supposed to be calculated? Earlier also they were there, now also they're there, but all of this is evolving with the changing landscape. Your earlier codes were all 50, 60, 70 years old. So obviously those standards cannot be adopted now. So you need better standards. You need standards which keep pace with the times. So labor codes are very important, although labor codes have not been implemented yet because the rules never came out. And even the DPDP Act has not been implemented because the rules are still being drafted. But for each of them, I think we are kind of waiting for the elections to get over, and then hopefully something will get implemented soon. But all of these things kind of tell you how the law is trying to evolve and come up with better corporate governance standards. Coming to listed companies, corporate governance again assumes a much bigger, and that is because unlike a private company where you're only looking at, say, a limited number of shareholders who are all closely holding the company, in a listed company you are potentially staring at crores of shareholders, lakhs of shareholders who are holding small percentages of your company. But again, it's very important for you to protect their interests as stakeholders. So whether you talk about the BRSR standards or whether you talk about some other SEBI standards, corporate governance requirements are much more fleshed out and much more stringent for listed companies. And I will give you a few examples here. So obviously BRSR standard we've already covered. One other good example here would be something called LODR regulations. Has anyone heard of the term LODR? Does it ring a bell? Yeah, you're right. Shashwat is saying listing obligations. That's correct. Listing obligations and the DNRR, listing obligations, and Prerak is saying disclosures, creates a disclosure mechanism. You're right. So LODR means listing obligations and disclosure requirements. So SEBI came up with, and again, I'm talking about whatever has happened in the past decade or so. SEBI came up with a new set of, earlier there were listing guidelines, or there was a listing agreement that companies needed to sign as part of listing their equity on a stock exchange. But now that listing agreement has been replaced with something called the listing obligations and disclosure requirements, LODR regulations 2015. Now LODR regulations 2015 underwent some important changes in 2023, which was last year. And these changes, the broad theme of these changes was to enhance corporate governance framework and ensure more accountability and transparency of information flow. Can someone tell me one point that this new amendment to the LODR tackled, which was actually very important? Well done, Shashwat. Absolutely right. This is market rumor verification. So from February 2024 onwards, the top 250 listed companies, top 100 companies from February and top 250 companies from August onwards now are mandated to actually, what used to happen? There used to be a rumor circulating in the market. You must have all seen market manipulation related TV series, movies, etc., where someone just randomly says something and the entire market moves, right? I don't know if you've heard of this character called Jaspal Bhatti. He used to do this thing called flop show. Jaspal Bhatti is unfortunately no more. But if you go to YouTube and type out Jaspal Bhatti shows, you'll find a lot of these very interesting videos. It used to come on DD Metro earlier as a growing up as a child in the 90s. I've seen a lot of that. So one very interesting episode, which is very widely watched, is something about two pani puri vendors on the street selling pani puris to customers. And then this was the time when there was no internet, no symmetry of information, lots of rumors in the market, rumor mongering in the market, and artificially bumping up the price to fueling those rumors, you bump up the price. So these pani puri sellers were giving their pani puris to Jaspal Bhatti and his friend, and Jaspal Bhatti was like a stockbroker in the market, very well renowned to bump up the prices of stocks. And he said, I am so good at my work that if you want, मैं रातों रात दिस पानी पूरी वाले को लखपति बना दूंगा, because it was early 90s. Obviously he said लखपति, not करोड़पति. He said मैं इसको लखपति बना दूंगा. तो वो बोला okay, challenge, why don't you do this? He called these pani puri walas at his office, and इसका company का नाम was Prem Prakash Pani Puri Wala, Pani Puri Wala. So he said, we will call your company PP Water Balls, and then PP Water Balls will now create financial statements. They will make some disclosures, and what we will do is we will create a rumor in the market through some agents who sit in the Chowk Choraha area and give gyan to 100 people, saying that some red lion company of UK is trying to acquire this Indian company. So this red lion eventually turned out to be Lal Singh. Lal Singh was their security guard, this company. So it was a very nice 10-15 minute thing where only on the basis of market rumors, he bumped up the price. He first created the company, ensured the stocks are listed, and he went through the entire loop. But then once the stock was listed, he spread this rumor about some potential collaboration with Red Lion. And because of that, the agents in the market started jacking up the price. And this is very similar to what happened in the Harshad Mehta scam as well, right? There was all market rumor based manipulation of stocks. So obviously, as I'm going back to the original theme, corporate governance at all times does not necessarily involve a legal obligation. So there was never a legal obligation on the company to verify or deny any rumors. Typical classic comments used to be given. We neither confirm nor deny. No comments, no reactions from companies. And what used to happen was, in the background, a lot of manipulation of stock price was happening. So to ensure, to compel companies to adopt better corporate governance standards, LODR was amended in 2023, and now these set of companies are required to either deny or confirm or clarify any rumors that are going on in the market, which is based on a reported event or information which is circulating in the mainstream media. So, I mean, rumor could be anyone talking about anything, but even in this episode that I'm telling you, Jaspal Bhatti's PP water balls, the rumor spread to an extent where this rumor was actually, this red line collaboration was actually in the newspapers. So this is the perfect recipe for disaster, and that's what the regulations have hit. It says if there is any information of a potential M&A, etc., circulating in the market, you need to clarify that, or you need to deny or confirm it. Similarly, there is now, for all listed companies, there is disclosure requirements which are based on the number of shares that you are acquiring in the company. So any acquirer which has acquired more than 5% shares in the company is required to make a disclosure at every 2% acquisition level. It's called the creeping acquisition level. So now, how does this interplay with M&A and corporate governance? You've heard of something called hostile takeovers? Yeah. In the 80s and 90s, it used to be really popular until India enacted its SEBI takeover regulations in 96 first and in 97 first and then 2011. So the reason to do all that was that someone who wants to acquire a company, rather than going and talking to the promoter and doing this amicably, used to take over the company through creeping acquisitions which were done by that person directly and through other persons. In the act, it's called persons acting in concert, PACs. Through self and PACs, they used to create 10 different companies and put 10 different people on the job to ensure that the company is kind of taken over, and the takeover threshold is 25%. Someone is asking me to repeat the creeping acquisition part. So essentially what it means is, if you hold 5% or more shares, more of the share capital of a company, then for every 2% shares that you acquire or you dispose, you are required to make a disclosure, and the relevant regulation is called 29. So regulation 29.1 and 29.2 of the SEBI regulations require you to make a disclosure upon acquiring or disposing any 2% shares. So what this is now doing is that it is creating symmetry of information in the market. Now there is no more a situation where mysteriously one day you look at the cap table of a listed company and you will see someone sitting at 30%. That's not possible, because every time this person over a period of time has acquired 2%, he would have disclosed. And if he wants to go from 0 to 31, which is, I guess, must be the first question coming in all of your mind, saying, what if he doesn't do a creeping acquisition? What if he acquires all the shares upfront? So the answer to that question is, anyone who wants to acquire any shares which, held together with the shares that he already holds, exceeds 25% of the company, he needs to do something which is known as a mandatory open offer, MTO, or mandatory open offer, under the SEBI requirement. And he needs to make an open offer of exit to 26% shareholders, at least 26% shareholders of the company. Exactly. SAT would come into play, Shashwat saying. So again, this is ensuring that there are no hostile takeovers. This is ensuring that information is symmetrical in the market. This ensures that you're not taking advantage of any sort of loopholes in the law, or advantage of, or taking undue advantage of your sort of market influence. Again, going back, SEBI is now regulating this category of professionals known as investment advisors and research analysts. Now, in order for you to give general gyan about buying and selling of stocks in the market, you have to be registered as an investment advisor or a research analyst. That is also one important step that SEBI has taken in the last 10 years to ensure better corporate governance standards in companies. Because a lot of times companies have been in hand in gloves with these companies, and their promoters have been hand in gloves with these researchers, quote unquote, in the market. And if the promoter wants some liquidity of his shares, if he wants to dispose 2% to, buy a new property somewhere or set up a new plant somewhere else, he would be like, let's jack up the price by say 10-20% and I will sell. How do you jack up the price? You call up your best friend, Mr. Daruwala, or whoever he's called, or in the market, been here 30 years giving buying selling advice. You call him up and say, hey, can you just ensure that you put a buy recommendation on me? Whenever you are in the media next, you just pump up a buy recommendation and let people buy my stocks. So if this person is a regulated professional, then he has obligations. If you look at the SEBI investment advisor framework and research analyst framework, there is a code of conduct. There's a professional code of conduct they need to fulfill, they need to follow. There are processes they need to follow before they give any investment advice. So again, to ensure corporate governance, the landscape is evolving. And lastly, from an LODR perspective, there's another section called Regulation 30, So there is one event-based disclosures and two, there are deemed material disclosures. Now these disclosures are anything that the company considers to be a material event, even if it is not fulfilling any of the specific requirements of the law. So this is again an interplay between corporate governance being strictly law and standing on that sort of borderline. So SEBI says, if you deem any information to be material, you disclose that, even if I have not technically asked you to disclose it. And SEBI has given a whole host of examples of these kind of transactions. And interestingly, signing a share purchase, signing a share subscription agreement or an investment agreement, or potential talks of a joint venture or a merger or acquisition are all part of that. So this is the SEBI framework. Last but not the least, one more theme that I would like to cover is something called the competition and antitrust laws. Do you know anything about competition antitrust laws? Anyone? And how competition and antitrust laws ensure better corporate governance in the form of level playing field in the market for all businesses? Any idea? Anyone would like to take a stab? I would love to hear from someone other than Siddhant. No one? Competition Act? Abuse of dominance triggers anti-competitive cause for action. Yeah. Regulates competition in the market. Correct. Correct. Now, how is it linked to corporate governance? I think a good answer from Prerak. It's a good hint. Again, we are talking about ethical standards. We are talking about standards which protect the interest of not only your stakeholders, but also creates the right kind of ripples in your industry, creates the right standards for the market, creates the right benchmarks for your industry. And Competition Act actually ensures all of these things are followed. Like Competition Act has concepts like abuse of dominant position. It has the concept of notifying or seeking approval of the Competition Commission of India for combinations. Again, now this enters your M&A territory, and this is also critical from the case study that we did in the beginning. If Eurofarm wants to acquire a stake or merge with this Indian company, what was the name? Wellern or something like that. So what is it required to do? If the numbers, which is the asset, it was called Healwell. So if Eurofarm wants to acquire a significant stake in Healwell or merge with Healwell, then it is required to ensure that if their combined assets and turnover in India crosses the de minimis threshold under the Competition Act, which is 350 crores and 1000 crores. So if it crosses the de minimis threshold, then that combination, this merger or this transaction is known as a combination under the Competition Act, is a notifiable event for CCI, Competition Commission of India. So you have to make an application to the Competition Commission of India, notifying them that you are entering into this transaction, and depending on, there are various channels under Competition Act. If any of you have read that, there is a green channel, there is a red channel, etc. So in certain cases, if your combination is not likely to be detrimental to competition in the market, you will get a quick clearance. And in sometimes actually it's a clearance where if the CCI does not respond within 30 days, you get deemed clearance also. But the idea is that the law is requiring you to ensure proper disclosure. It is requiring you to ensure that any combination that you enter into does not create a new entity which completely destroys competition in the market. So that is combinations. We talked about abuse of dominant position. You would have seen lots of these matters which are filed against the likes of Googles and your Amazons and Apples of the world for abuse of dominant position. Because Google ka recently, if you know, there's this new thing which is happening about commissions, where Google is sort of charging commissions for hosting ads on its platform, and they're actually kind of also alleged to be creating deterrents for them to go to some other platforms. There's a lot of technical details around it, but the idea is that whatever Google is doing by abusing its dominant position is something which doesn't fit into the corporate governance standpoint, which doesn't fit into the parameters of how you are required to be a market leader in an industry where you are supposed to be a role model rather than be someone who kills or destroys the others. Then there is cartelization, right? If 3, 4, 5 entities come together, create a combination which destroys and sort of gets complete price leverage. For example, like if Coke and Pepsi come together today, and then they can basically price their products at whatever they want to, right? So, and the concept under Competition Act is any combination or any of this which causes an appreciable adverse effect on competition, AAEC, in the market, that is frowned upon or that is not accepted by the competition regulator of India. So again, the Competition Act and the competition regulator ensures that, again, yeah, Book My Show is a good example. Acquisition of newer entrants and creation of policies is a base concern, allows for better competition. Yeah, it creates better level playing field in the market. And when you, and for example, lastly, I'll leave you with this thought, like a lot of what Google was doing, was alleged to be doing in terms of commissions, a lot of these arrangements that your Amazons, etc., predatory pricing concept hai, where you are discounting the product to a level where it's below the MRP, it's below the cost price of the product. So some of these things are law, some of these things earlier were not part of the law, so you got a free hand to do whatever the hell you wanted to. But because they were not perceived to be correct corporate governance standards, they were not perceived to be the correct ethical standards in the market, the law caught up. The Competition Act is also now, I don't know if you know or not, the Competition Act has now been amended. It's still waiting some clearances before it becomes a law. It's not implemented yet. But now there is a transaction size based threshold that is being introduced for transactions. Earlier the threshold for notifying combinations was only based on assets and turnover. Now, because the new age companies, there is no asset, no turnover. There might be like a 3-year-old startup which is loss making. There are no assets, so they would technically get the benefit of de minimis protection. So they would go under de minimis protection and then do whatever the hell they wanted to do because that transaction was not notifiable to CCI. Now the Competition Amendment Act has introduced a threshold which says that if the transaction exceeds a particular value, then that transaction is notifiable irrespective of assets and turnover. So again, what is the law doing? The law is trying to catch up and ensure better corporate governance standards. And in terms of the sectors where you will see this more and more often, because you are budding lawyers and you would want to read up more, you would want to sort of get yourself more familiarized with sector specific laws. I mean, the hot sectors in the market for M&A, which equally continue to be hot sectors from an ESG, data protection, competition, EHS, and corporate governance standpoints, is, I would say, obviously topping the list is anything to do with tech. We already talked about ed tech, ad tech, agri tech, and all those kind of things, e-commerce. Then a lot of focus is now on renewables. Again, needless to say how renewables kind of overlaps with ESG standards, especially the E part of it. There's a lot of new focus on companies that generate solar energy, companies that produce EV vehicles, etc. EV is technically not renewables. EV is a different segment, but again, something that creates a better environment is being liked by the M&A market, is being liked by the investors. Then a lot of focus is now on manufacturing, because the government is giving performance linked incentives to a lot of the Apples of the world and Teslas of the world to come up and set up their manufacturing operations in India. And because manufacturing has historically been a very ESG heavy sort of thing, because they employ thousands of workers, they have lots of factories and plants, etc. They have lots of environment related issues. So ESG, corporate governance, is very critical even in the manufacturing segment. And obviously IT and ITES services, anything to do with tech, IT, creation of tech infrastructure, data centers, handling of customer information, etc. The SaaS, service as a software, etc. These kind of sectors are also very hot from an M&A perspective, and they are also very critical from corporate governance. In this, if the manufacturing plant, etc., is not that relevant, data protection becomes very relevant. how you handle customer data and the like. So these are the broad sort of themes that I wanted to cover in today's discussion. My only hope is I don't think I've been able to cover a lot, but my only hope is whatever I've covered, you can take something away today, and sort of it kind of pricks your curiosity a little bit in trying to figure out, what are the emerging trends in M&A today, and how you as lawyers can be an instrument of change by sort of inculcating in your clients and investors and founders and promoters this sense of how law always needs to go hand in hand. Legal compliance always needs to go hand in hand with business operations, and one without the other will obviously is doomed to fail and is a recipe for disaster. So thank you very much once again to the RF MLR team. I'm hoping that there are some questions, and I would love to take some of them for sure. So please go ahead if you have anything to ask.
I request all the participants to either send the questions on chat or raise their hand so that I can unmute them. So before anyone else asks some questions, I have some questions myself. So there's a different tangent that you didn't explore, but you mentioned it in the beginning, that there are some traditional sectors that are going down. So as you mentioned the sectors that are coming up, in your opinion, what are the sectors that have been in the lower rankings according to you?
From a business perspective, but I meant more from an M&A perspective. Like, earlier, traditionally, you would see M&As more focused in something like a big FMCG was like the flavor of the market in the 90s and the early 2000s, right? When the big brands were coming to India, you would see the Unilevers taking over the HUL and becoming, HUL is a classic case, right? HUL's parent company is Unilever PLC. So HUL is not really an Indian company. Similarly, you would see a lot of M&A in companies like Britannia, the Daburs of the world. You build a sustainable FMCG brand, and you would have strategic investors lining up and sort of coming to take away some part of your equity. Now, the reason something like an FMCG, obviously it continues to be a big focus area for strategic M&A, but if you ask a VC fund or if you ask a big private equity fund, are they going to put 5% of stake or 3% of stake in a big FMCG company, versus if they're given an option, are they going to put their money in an artificial intelligence company, right, or an AI sort of company? They would obviously go for the latter, right? Because FMCGs and the traditional sectors have always followed that cockroach approach in the market, where it takes time, slowly and steadily to build a sustainable business. You talk about retail, you talk about FMCG, you talk about pharma, you talk about financial services and the core financial services, banks, NBFCs, etc. How many bank mergers have you seen in the recent past happening in the private space? Leave aside HDFC and HDFC Limited, which happened recently, but that's also not one bank merging into the other or one bank getting a big investor. It's a different synergy that HDFC was exploring. But in these traditional sectors, typically you have to wait for the long haul, and you are kind of better suited to be acquired or partnering with a strategic investor. And strategic investors historically, since the liberalization of our economy in the 90s, have been coming from US and UK, US and European jurisdictions primarily. But you know what Europe is going through, right? I mean, they're going through a slump of their own with the whole Brexit thing, recession kicking in. So the number of M&As that you see where German entities are now trying to buy out Indian companies is gradually reducing. And what you are now seeing is those German companies, their founders are actually pooling in their money along with other high net worth individuals and creating new venture capital funds or private equity funds, the pension boards and all that. And these funds are now investing in sunrise sectors. So all these sectors that I tell you, renewable, tech, manufacturing, IT, ITES, AI, etc., are sunrise sectors. It doesn't mean that the other sectors are not doing well. That is the backbone of all economy. If your manufacturing doesn't happen, if your retail doesn't happen, the country, the GDP will massively go down. But you're not seeing a lot of traditional M&A activity happening in those sectors.
Secondly, sir, as you mentioned, a lot of regulations exist right now. But as a very a preliminary question, it would be that how we can expect that when there are more than 100 regulations there existing, can a company comply with all of that, even with a the whole team of lawyers? Is it possible to have all kind of compliances in order?
That's actually a very good question, because when you become lawyers, if you work at a law firm, you'll figure out that you're starved on a due diligence mandate where you have to figure out all the licenses, permits, and compliances that a company need to fulfill on the one hand, and on the other hand, you need to give a true picture to your client in terms of what compliances the company is actually fulfilling and where the company is falling short. So, Pranav, what happens is eventually it all boils down to materiality. Like, again, giving you a classic example, if a company has not filed its EPF challans in the last 3 months, that is case one. Case two, a company has defaulted on gratuity payments to 5 of its employees. Now, the question is, both of them are technically non-compliances, but one of them is a graver non-compliance than the other. Not filing challans, okay, I'll file them, we'll pay some penalty and get done with it. But not paying gratuity to your employees who have been trying to fight out and who are rightfully entitled to gratuity, it's a bigger problem, because it again talks about perception. It actually talks about how you think, it talks about how your governance standards are. So what we do is, and then again, it also depends on what the investor is looking for. When the investor is a lender, for example, he's putting in money through debentures, then they are not kind of bothered on a lot of these very minute corporate compliances. Whereas if someone wants to acquire 100% of the company, they would be more bothered about whether you have a proper secretarial team which is filing all the documents or not, whether you have a proper HR team which ensures your HR policies are met or not. So for each of these themes, we are asked to actually color code. Nowadays, color coding has become very prominent. Color code all the issues and non-compliances through traffic signals. We do red, amber, and green. So green is also a non-compliance and an issue. Amber is also a non-compliance, and red is also a non-compliance. But red are major non-compliances which could be deal breakers. So even the investor knows that India is overburdened with laws and there are hundreds of laws applicable. So typically, I will tell you 90 of their legal non-compliances will fall in the green zone, 6 or 7 will fall in the amber zone, and only 2-3 will fall in the red zone. But the ones that fall in the red zone will require serious intervention. Like, for example, your Environment Act certificate having run out or having been expired. That's a big one, right? Versus making some environmental filings, which could be done post facto as well.
Right. So I think there are two main things. One is the kind of compliance that has not been done, and secondly is the kind of investment the investor is looking forward to, right? Yeah. Okay. So we have two questions in the chat box. That's yeah, 3 in fact. Yeah, 4. Yeah, they're coming up. Yeah. So the first one is from Suam. Do you think that instrument issuers should reveal their liquidity positions to their potential stakeholders, so that there is credibility behind an issuer's ability to make good on its debts?
So Soham, I don't really follow your question, because when you say potential stakeholders, who are your potential stakeholders? If you're talking about shareholders, the shareholders know your liquidity position because they get your financial statements every year. They get your quarterly statements if you're a listed company. And as a shareholder, you always have the right to inspect all the financial documents of the company. If you're talking about a potential investor, the investor will obviously do a financial and legal due diligence of the company. So they will be asking you very pointed questions on your cash flow positions, your liability positions, your asset positions, and they will get to know what your liquidity position and credit worthiness is. So yes, the question to your answer is The question to your answer is yes, but there's nothing additional to be done here. As long as companies are presenting their accounts and numbers in a true and fair manner, I don't think there's anything further that needs to be done here. The law is all there.
Okay, sir. The second question is for Mansi. Sir, what is the estimated gestation period for an M&A transaction, and how does the role of business consultants differ from that of an M&A lawyer in bringing together like-minded companies?
Yeah, so there are two parts to this question. One is, what are the timelines involved? So classically, any debt transaction typically takes a much lesser time period than an M&A transaction involving equity investments, as I told you earlier as well, because the focus of a lender is to just ensure that the company has a good cash position and a sustainable business so that their monies can be returned with interest. That's the goal that a lender comes in with. But an equity investor might be coming in to maximize its returns if he's like a financial investor in the form of, say, VC funds or a private equity investor. And if that investor is a strategic investor, he would want to come in and grow with the business. And just classically, like our Eurofarm and then that Indian entity that we were discussing, the idea is to synergize and grow together. So when the idea is to synergize and grow together, when the idea is to share your brand name, where the idea is to enter a new territory by putting in money in a company where a lot is at stake from a reputational perspective, from a financial perspective, obviously the gestation period is longer. You would first try and understand how exactly the operations of the company are being run. And I will repeat myself, in an M&A transaction of a big scale, which involves proper synergies and sort of brand sharing, etc., you would see all of these. You would see ESG reports being thrown in. You would see a technical due diligence. You would see financial due diligence. You would see commercial due diligence, legal due diligence. You would see extensive discussions on whether we would set up a new company and how will the new company look like, who's going to be sitting on the board, how are decisions going to be taken in that company, who is going to be the CEO. Now, again, giving you a very recent example, the Z Sony merger deal has failed, right? Why did the Z Sony merger deal fail? It was in the works for a number of years. It got signed, it got approvals from various courts, it got competition commission approval as well, but it failed on a very simple corporate governance matter. It failed because Sony wanted someone else to be the CEO of the entity and not the present. I'm just missing the name of that person. Mr. Subhash Chandra's son was the existing CEO. There were some allegations of alleged financial irregularities, etc., corporate governance issues. So Sony wanted the present CEO to go out and a new CEO to be appointed by them. So just imagine the length and breadth to which the lawyers and the advisors would have gone to reach this stage. And then this one small point of CEO appointment just became so big that the deal failed, right? Because it went into trust issues and whatnot. So that's why M&A deals take a lot of time. I mean, if everything is straightforward, it's a small business to be acquired, end to end, your M&A deal could ambitiously potentially end in, say, 6 weeks from beginning, but assuming everything is already decided and there's nothing much to look at, very minimal diligence. But on the other side of the spectrum, I have also worked on M&A deals which have taken more than a year to fructify. If you leave aside regulatory approvals, purely negotiation, documentation, diligence, etc., can be done in 3-4 months. But then when regulatory approvals are required, then it's a completely different ballgame altogether. Now, to answer the second part of your question, business consultants here, I think by business consultants, we're actually trying to say merchant bankers or investment bankers, because these are the set of advisors who are responsible to ensure that if you are a buyer, you get a seller, or if you're a seller, you get a buyer. If you're an Indian company looking to raise funds through credible investors, you go to a merchant banker. He will try to go out in the market, scout for potential investors, and he will go out to the potential investors, pitch him that this is a great company, why don't you invest? and then he will try to get these two like-minded people together. He will gauge whether they will get along, not get along. And it's very important for merchant bankers to ensure that, because unlike lawyers, we perform legal due diligence, we do transaction documents, negotiations, etc. We provide regulatory and legal advice, but we get paid a fixed fee or fees for the number of hours that we are working on the matter. But a lot of the merchant banker and IBs get paid based on success fee. So their whole financial model is, for example, hypothetically, they could say 1% of transaction fees upon success. So if the synergies don't match and the deal fails, they are actually putting a lot of money at stake here, and they are kind of foregoing their money. So it's very important for business consultants to ensure that like-minded people come together for an M&A transaction.
Okay, sir. So let's yeah. Do you want to say something?
Lots and lots of questions pouring in.
Yeah.
So I think
Let's
we
take
don't have
last
much
question.
time.
Yeah,
So
last
yeah,
question.
let's take one last question. Why don't you choose which one I should take, depending on the topic that we are discussing today?
So I think the last one is more suitable. So I'll read that for everyone. Any instance where you have observed a unique resolution in terms of corporate governance upheaval that allowed for founders' paths being reconciled with the synergy of the M&A to prevent events like Mindtree, L&T debacle?
Where you've observed a unique resolution. I mean, I would want to understand this question in a sort of. I would want to understand this question slightly better. Are you trying to say that, have I seen any situation in my years of working as a lawyer where founders sort of did not get along well together and then they eventually reconciled to ensure that the company doesn't go to CIRP or the company doesn't get dissolved? I mean, is that the question? Or are you talking about some good resolution coming out from the CIRP process? Is that the question? Because it's quite common in the market. Like, I can't obviously name my clients, but we've seen huge multinational conglomerates where promoters have had differences between them. Promoters and investors have had differences between them because of certain provisions in the agreement, because of certain decisions that the promoters were onboarded. And you know what typically happens? That a lot of the times your promoters would want to go in a particular direction which ensures expansion, which is more towards entering a new territory, a new market, or a new product portfolio. And the investor would be like, no, let's walk the tightrope here, let's be a little more cautious, let's not follow that approach. And investors obviously have a veto right over a lot of these things. If they don't approve of a new of a market expansion or a new product, that decision doesn't go through. Typically in 50-50 joint venture situations, the board is deliberately kept in a manner where two people are appointed by the by one party and the other two people are appointed by the other party to ensure that there is a deadlock. It sounds funny, but typically the board of a company under the Companies Act is required to pass decisions by a simple majority, right? And a simple majority can be achieved where either of the founders or the investor has a majority representation on the board. But as lawyers, we are instructed to draft documents where, in case of any decision where both the parties are not aligned, that decision results in a deadlock situation. Now, once a deadlock situation hits, there are deadlock resolution mechanisms that we build into the agreement, because typically what happens is these decisions are taken at business level, at a mid seniority level of sort of, from a governance standpoint. People who are taking this decision are people who are on the board or people who are at, say, management level positions in each of these companies. But once this deadlock happens, means that these people are not on board. Then we have provisions which say that the CEOs of both the companies or their group heads, or if the companies have an ultimate holding company, the CEOs of those ultimate holding companies will sit and talk and try to resolve this in a period of 30 days. If it doesn't resolve, then we would have some market expert coming in as an intermediary and trying to resolve the dispute. If nothing works out, you go to arbitration. So we've actually supervised a lot of these situations where deadlocks have happened, and the deadlocks have been resolved through reconciliation between CEOs in terms of whether the company should adopt a particular path or it should not follow that path.
Okay, sir.
I
Thank
think
you.
Prerak clarified his question. He's saying in relation
Yeah.
to the buying out of a smaller firm where founders were not aligning with how the control of the firm would go. Yeah, of course. This is what I mentioned as
Yeah.
well. I mean, a lot of these small time businesses based in rural India or these remote tier 2 cities, tier 3 towns, these promoters and founders do not know anything about corporate governance. They know nothing about the direction in which they want to take their business, especially when a huge global conglomerate wants to come and gobble them up. They are typically scared. They are typically ill advised most of the times to be very wary of any proposal that is on the table. So, what is classically done, and I will leave you with this thought, Prerak, is that a lot of times what we try to come up is a solution that works for both, and that solution is in the form of transition arrangements. What we say is if that German company wants to buy 100% of this Indian company today, they will only acquire say 80 or 85% of the company on day one, and 15 to 20% of the company will still remain with the promoter. Now what this does is the investor wants business continuity. He wants to ensure that he gets 2-3 years time period to understand that business and how it's run before they kick this person out completely. And what the promoter gets is an incentive called a performance linked incentive in the form of his CEO agreement or his directorship agreement, where if he steers the company in a good direction in the next 2-3 years, he will get a huge paycheck. So even if he's not willing to take the company on a particular path, he's then kind of forced to do that because his performance based incentive is linked to that to the company taking that path, and that path is most of the times coming from the majority shareholders. So spat isliye nahi hota hai because that person knows that I'm going to be here only for the next 2-3 years, so I will eventually not say no to anything that they are proposing unless I see that my no is extremely important to ensure that the company doesn't bite the dust. So a lot of these situations come up. You have to see practically how this works in from a case to case basis.
Thank you for your answer, sir. I think this brings end to the today's session. On behalf of the entire editorial board of the Arjunal Financial Mercantile Law Review, I would really like to thank Mr. Shankar again for taking out his valuable time from his busy schedule and conducting such an informative session. Your valuable insights and extensive knowledge have been very enlightening in understanding the practical aspects of M&A transactions. We have had the pleasure of listening to you online for a very long time, sir. But it would be really great if we can have you at our campus and have an offline insightful session. Is that possible, sir, soon?
Sure, for sure. In fact, Pawar sir has been calling us for a long time to do our 10-year alumni meet because we were from the 2013 batch.
Oh.
2023 has now passed, and I would invite the existing students of the university to take an initiative. And I mean, I'm using this platform and going out to you guys saying that it is very important for us, especially, I mean, non-RGNL students can ignore this, but it is very important to build a strong alumni network. And for that, you need to create more opportunities to invite your alumni to campuses, not only one person as a resource person for a seminar or a workshop, but I think you should take an initiative where you invite all the people from a particular batch and take something for a bahana, right? You say that, oh, 10 years of the 2013 batch. Okay, wow, why don't we try and set up a meet and invite all of them? And you know what went wrong in that whole alumni meet thing is that everyone was very busy and we just could not figure out the operational aspects of it. The university gave us a lot of support. Pawar sir was very welcoming, and a lot of the other faculty members were also trying their best, you know, to make this work. But it just didn't happen. So I think you just need to create those small windows of opportunity where you can get 5 to 10, 15 people at the same time to your campus. This will ensure that you get opinions and coverage from every area of the market, whether be it litigation or law firms or someone who's in the judiciary, etc. So I would love to come, but it just needs to be the right platform.
Sure, sir. Sure. We'll take this into account and we'll surely try to have that alumni meet.
Thank you
very
very
good.
much. Have a
Very
good
good.
weekend, everyone.
Yeah. Just before we end this session, I just want to inform all the participants that all the registered participants will be receiving an MCQ-based assessment post the session, which would include questions around the discussions we had. And certificates would be provided to everyone who successfully completes the same. Once again, I thank Mr. Shankar for this session and everyone for joining. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.